You have a moral duty to supersede the accomplishments of the person who bore that name and gave it its weight before you dare capitalize on it in the public sphere. And Trudeau did none of that. He was a part-time drama teacher, fundamentally. He hadn't run a business. He just didn't know enough to be prime minister. So that's a big part of the issue. I don't believe that he ever says a word that's true. From what I've been able to observe, it's all stage acting. He's crafted a persona. He has a particular instrumental goal in mind, and everything is subordinated to serve that.
Why? What's the motivation?
According to Jordan, Trudeau is just another narcissist, and he's convinced Conservative Republicans are trying to mess with Canadian democracy.
The same motivation that's generally typical of people who are narcissistic, which is to be accredited with moral virtue in the absence of the work necessary to actually attain it.
All right.
He's playing a role. You know, the swastika thing, it's like really
just untrue. About
Canadians, really, we're going to be worried about in Canada? Because I had protests, for example, where people accused me of attracting. First of all, that just isn't a thing in Canada. There isn't a tradition. And I don't know anyone in Canada who's ever met anyone who's met someone who was Canadian and so that's just a non-starter. And so when that sort of thing gets dragged into the conversation, right off the bat, you know, the Canadians shouldn't be subjected to the inherent violence of a swastika. First of all, it's not even obvious what that swastika was doing there. There's reasonable evidence to suggest that the person who was waving it was either a plant or someone who was making the comment that that was what was characteristic of the government, not of what they believe. Now, no one knows, because the story around that event is messy, and it's not like there were credible journalists who were going in there to investigate thoroughly. But to use that and the Confederate flag issue is exactly the same thing. You know, the story in Canada, our Prime Minister implemented the Emergencies Act, and so the question was why? And so I went on Twitter when this was trending and read at least 5,000 Twitter comments to try to get a sense. These were people who were supporting Trudeau in his application of the Emergencies Act. And I was trying to figure out, okay, well, what do they believe is happening? And the story seemed to be, and this is as far as I can tell, and maybe I'm wrong, the story was something like, "Make America great again."
Conservative Republicans are trying to mess with Canadian democracy.
Conservative Republicans on the, pretty far right were attempting to destabilize Canadian democracy. And so my question was, well, what makes you think they care, first of all, about Canada and its democracy? And second, why in the world would they possibly do that? You need a motive for a like that. And that was at the same time the CBC was insisting, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, which is subsidized by the Liberals to the tune of $1.2 billion a year, was insisting that most of the money that the truckers raised was foreign financed. If it wasn't the bloody Russians, then it was the American Conservatives. And so that all turned out to be a complete lie. And so fine, it's Republican right-wingers trying to destabilize Canadian democracy. Why? No one has an answer for that, because what's in it for them? And then, okay, 3 days later, the Emergency Act was lifted. And I thought, okay, now what are they going to make of that? What could possibly be the rationale for that? And the rationale was, well, that just shows you how effective he was. We had this coup ready to go that was financed by Americans, apparently, and our Prime Minister acted so forthrightly that we only needed to be under the strictures of the Emergency Act for 3 days. It's like, okay, I don't even know what sort of world I exist in where those things are happening. So, and then Canadians, why do Canadians buy this to the degree they do? And I think they're faced with a hard choice.
For a handful of years, our nation's foundation held firm, where faith in governance transcended partisan sway, a testament to our enduring unity.
Because in my country, for 150 years, you could trust the basic institutions. You could trust the government. It didn't matter what political party was running it. You could trust the political parties, right from the socialists over to the conservatives. The socialists were mostly union types, and they were trying to give the working class a voice, and honestly so. You could trust the media. Even the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation was a reliable source of news. None of that's true now, and so Canadians are asked to make a hard choice, or were in the truckers' convoy situation, and the choice was, well, either all your institutions are almost irretrievably corrupt, or the truckers were financed by like right-wing Republican Americans. After the Liberals had brought in a Harvard intellectual who was a Canadian to be their last leader, he didn't work out. And then they're flailing about for a leader. And the Liberals in Canada are pretty good at maintaining power and leadership and have been the dominant governing party in Canada for a long time. And so they went to Justin and said, well, you know, it's you or a conservative. And you can imagine that's not a positive specter for someone who's on the left or even a liberal, especially, and Trudeau's quite a bit on the left. And they said, we need you to run. And then I thought, okay, well, the answer to that should have been no, because Justin has no training for this and no experience. He's a part-time drama teacher fundamentally. He hadn't run a business.
Jordan doubts Trudeau's qualifications for Prime Minister.
He just didn't know enough to be Prime Minister. But then I'm trying to put myself in his position, So it's like, okay, I don't know enough, but I'm young, and we don't want the Conservatives. And they had a run, a 10-year run, so maybe it was time for a new government. Maybe I could grow into this man. Maybe I could surround myself with good people, and I could learn humbly, and I could become the person I'm now pretending to be, which we all have to do as we move forward, right? And so then I thought, okay, I think you made a mistake there because you ran only on your father's name and you didn't have the background, but let's give the devil his due and say that's no problem. Okay, so now what do? Well, you get elected and your first act is to make the cabinet 50% women, despite the fact that only 25% of the elected members are female. His father was very famous.
Sure.
And so that put Trudeau at a tremendous advantage with regards to moving into a leadership position in Canada. It's not excusable. You should move ahead on your own merits, especially if you're daring to do something like run a country. It's like, you have a moral duty. If you have the advantage of a name, you have a moral duty to supersede the accomplishments of the person who bore that name and gave it its weight before you dare capitalize on it in the public sphere. And Trudeau did none of that. He knows how to behave. He knows how to act in public. He had the upbringing for it. Other than that, there's nothing there, not that I can see. And if there was, he wouldn't have run the way he did. He's not an impressive person in my estimation.
Some strong opinions there, strong beliefs there.
When he appointed 50% of females to 50% of his cabinet, because it was, what did he say? Because it's 2015. It's like, no, quarter of your elected.
Jordan believes Trudeau's responsibility should be to appoint the most qualified individuals, regardless of their gender.
Members of Parliament were female. If your job was to pick the most qualified people, period, regardless of their genitalia, because they're leading the country. You pick the most qualified people. Instead, he abdicated his responsibility to make those difficult decisions and then wallpapered it over with this casual virtue of, well, I'm going to promote women. It's like, no, you're going to promote competent people, you weasel.
We know that it depends on relegating your tribal affiliations to the general idea of being an American. We are regressing into tribalism. And so we're starting to revert to a pre-civilizational tribalism. I think large swaths of the United States are tribal now.
Victor Davis Hanson insists that we must take lessons about government with utmost seriousness.
Well, I think we should take these lessons very seriously, both from the point of the attacker and the attacked, because you mentioned some of the commonalities. At the end of the book, I give you a kind of a common denominator blueprint, and people who have not been defeated or are accustomed to a position of superiority, culturally, militarily, they think that they're invulnerable forever, and they're not aware of insidious decline. Thebes that Alexander took is not the Thebes of Epaminondas. And yet the walls look as stout as they ever were. And the people are the same, they think. Same thing with Carthage, the same thing with Constantinople. They said, nobody's ever going to get through the walls. They tried just early, 50 years earlier, they couldn't do it. We're invulnerable. And people said, well, we're not the same people. They don't think that anybody would ever dream of extinguishing them.
He declares that our civilization is currently at its pinnacle.
This is the pinnacle of our civilization, etc. Constantinople, this is the city of Constantine and Justinian. We can't fall. So there's an unreality. And then they have no idea who they're facing. They have no idea what's in the mind of Cortez. They have no idea.
Do we have any idea what's in the mind of Xi Jinping or Vladimir Putin?
We have no idea. We think that Xi thinks, as I think George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, all bipartisan, they all thought that he is so impressed with Western civilization. He's globalizing, he's changed his economy. Yes, he's rough around their edges, but our leisure, our affluence, globalization will acculturate them, and China will hit their place among the family of nations.
Because, of course, they want to be like us.
They want us, and they don't understand that is exactly what the Byzantines said about the Ottomans. That's exactly what people said about Alexander. That's exactly what they said about the Carthage.
There's an unreality at play, and understanding the attacker's capabilities is crucial.
And these people don't understand. So whether it's Putin, so when Putin says, I'm going to use weapons if I lose, and there's been about 17 threats from high members of the Russian military, high members of the Russian parliament, such as it is, and Putin himself, tactical even. We say, this is crazy. They would never do that. We never say, well, if I was going to lose and be humiliated, or if I wanted in the breadbasket of the old Soviet Union and ports on the Black Sea and a window right onto Europe, I'd be willing to do a lot of stuff for it. And right. I've done, so there's an unreality, and then on the part of the attacker, they need to understand what the attacker is capable of. I just add one quick thing.
Yep.
I also mentioned the serial threats that China has given Taiwan. And they even made a brief film about Japan if it interfered, called in
the Chinese
Communist.
And they've distributed that in China.
Yes, just like Erdogan has said that he was going to send missiles and destroy Athens, he was going to destroy. He said, I'm going to do the same thing to the Armenians, and he just ethnically cleansed 100,000 of them.
Victor asserts that Americans have always been number one.
If we would look at ourselves dispassionately and not say we're Americans, we're always number 10, we would say the following. We've never had, in terms of the percentage of GDP debt or in actual numbers, except for a brief period in World War II, $35 trillion we owe, and we are borrowing $1 trillion every 100 days. It's completely unsustainable. We've never had the military admit to us that it is short 40,000 troops and they don't know where to get them at a time when the American population has never been larger. The Army missed its recruiting goals last year by 10%. Yes. And that was not the first year. And we've had a porous border. We have never had no border at all. It ceased to exist. We've had 10 million people walk across without audit. We've never seen anything like it. We have the largest number of foreign-born residents, both in numbers, 50 million, and in percentages of the resident population, 13, we've ever had, at a time when we have lost confidence in the melting pot. Okay. We've had high areas before, high periods. We've never had a period in American history where our elites say that it's a social construct, and you have to let somebody, a violent, out the same day that he's arrested. That's a new theory, critical legal theory. Okay, we're a multiracial society, and we're the only successful multiracial democracy. We know that it depends on relegating your tribal affiliations to the general idea of being an American. We are regressing into tribalism.
He claims that what happened in Afghanistan is unlike anything America has done before.
So when you look at all of these challenges and you look at the symptoms, we have never done anything like Afghanistan. Just completely flee and leave $50 billion in weaponry to an organization that's selling all over the globe. Never had that before. We have never had, since World War II, a Verdun. We have passed the numbers of and wounded in Verdun. We're above 700,000 wounded, missing, or killed Russians and Ukrainians. And we're headed to Somme territory. And nobody has any idea how to stop this. Russia is not going to be able to take all of it, and we are not going to be able to get back the Donbass and Crimea. So it's going to continue. Nobody has an answer. Nobody takes serious that the Chinese would be crazy enough to go across the Taiwanese Strait and try to take that city. They say they can do it. So my point is, never have we been faced with such existential challenges in the post-war period, at a period when we are so weak, or at least we're not naturally weak. Our constitution is there, our natural resources, we lead the world. But when you look at debt, when you look at the border, when you look at our universities, which were the envy of the world, they were the engine that drove American culture and power and technology, and they're in crisis. Science is in crisis.
So we're like the Thebans. We're not the same people.
We're not the same people. We're not the same people that maybe we have it in us. We're not the same people who stormed Omaha Beach when the first 2,000 people were mowed down.
We seem to believe that inaugurating new woke programs is the most important thing.
We think that the most important thing is canceling student debt or inaugurating new woke programs, but it's going to take us 7 years to replace the Javelin anti-tank weapons. We're short 155 millimeter. That was our signature. We were the biggest producer of shells in the world. We're not doomed. We need to learn from wise men like Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, John Kennedy, even to an extent Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, and the rest of them. They all had one thing.
You're not going to mention Ronald Reagan?
Yeah, I'm getting to him.
Oh, all right.
And in a period of doubt where people had questioned their so-called Neanderthal approach to human nature, that they believed that deterrence and not dialogue or the UN kept the peace, along came Ronald Reagan. And he said, he basically said the degree which we are safe is the degree to which we help our friends and tell our enemies to be careful, because we will defend us and we're going to have the capability to do it. Deterrence, 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 which is just a Latin word to scare somebody off from doing something stupid. And if you don't believe in deterrence, then as Vegetus said, if you want peace, prepare for peace.
Victor argues that the concept of citizenship is a relatively recent idea.
The idea of citizenship's pretty recent in the long history of civilization. It appeared somewhere around 700 BC in rural Greece and swept pretty quickly. And so by the 5th century, there were 1,500 city-states. And what it was the first time that citizens were self-governing, and that meant that they were pretty clearly defined. They made up their own militias. They adjudicated the circumstances under which they would go to. They voted for their own officials. And more importantly, they had property rights. They could pass on property. I think that was the catalyst for citizenship, the right of inheritance, that the state couldn't expropriate or own property from the individual. And then that long odyssey brought us to, of course, the founding of the United States, and there were clear distinctions between a resident that happened to live in the United States and a citizen. A citizen alone could vote, a citizen alone could hold office, a citizen alone could leave the boundaries and come back into the United States on his own volition. A citizen alone was eligible for federal services, or in most states, and a citizen served in the military. I don't think any of those still apply, those distinctions between a resident and a citizen, with the exception of holding office, and that's under assault. I know here in California, people who are not just non-citizens, but here illegally can vote, say, in a Berkeley school board election. And now there's efforts to make sure that people can run for office who are not citizens. Non-citizens serve in the military. Non-citizens actually can go across the border with greater facility than you or I could probably. And so we are a nation, we've never had this before, of 50 million people in the United States that were born in a foreign country of different statuses. Some are legal residents, some are illegal residents, some are citizens. Some are migrants back and forth, and that's the highest in actual numbers and in percentages of the population. And unfortunately, it comes at a time when we, the hosts, have lost confidence in the traditional melting pot of assimilation, integration, intermarriage. And so we're starting to revert to a pre-civilizational tribalism. I think large swaths of the United States are tribal now.
The United States was founded on the principle of equality of opportunity.
Another way of putting it is the United States was based on an idea of equality of opportunity, that because we're not born equal, or we have different life experiences, or we inherit or don't inherit, or we're healthy or we're long-lived or not, we don't try to even that out in terms of economic recompense. We just let people follow their own trajectories, and then we have other methods to appeal to their magnanimity. So the philanthropic, the religious, the humanism. We have all these ways that if people do better than other people, we allow them to be creative and to try to give back to the society, or at least use their talents, even if it's profit-minded, to build a better bridge or a dam, rather than the alternate, which is a strain in Western civilization. It starts, actually, the socialist impulse starts with the Greeks. There is a strain of that with the Pythagoreans. But the other idea, and that's what we're, I think, fighting now, is the woke equality of result, that we're going to appoint some Platonic guardians and give them untold power. And in their infinite wisdom, they're going to do two things. They're going to force people to be equal, what they call equity, and they're never going to be subject to the consequences of their own ideology, because they need special exemptions given their enormous responsibilities and their talent. And so what we see now is this bi-coastal elite in the United States is starting to mandate behaviors and principles and issues and policies that they themselves would never follow and would have no intention of following. And it's based on that every single person has an innate right to be the same as another person. Or it was that Aristotle said, once a man in democracy, and he feared this, feels that he's equal in voting with another man, then he feels, by extension, he should be equal in all other aspects of his life. And that was the philosophical worry about democracy, that it always evolved to a more radical form of equality. I think we're now at the end stage where almost everybody feels they have a grievance against the state, and therefore they're entitled to compensatory or reparatory money or land. Here in California, when we were discussing reparations, suddenly people were bidding in the Oakland City Council and suggesting that they were owed $800,000. And they had a grievance, apparently, even though they were 6 generations away from, and maybe 4 from, they were in the 4th generation of the civil rights movement. They had grievances against people who had never had, in California, for example, had never been a state. But it was that mentality, and a lot of people warned us about this. Tocqueville said the problem that we would face in the United States is that most people innately would rather be poor and equal than all better off, but some more better off than others. And he felt that if that would be a very dangerous development. I think we're pretty much there now.
The question of who polices the police was a major issue for globalists in the 20th century.
One of the problems that globalists or cosmopolitans learned very early in the 20th century during the progressive movement was when you surrender sovereignty to these international bodies, then who is the police? Who polices the police? So the League of Nations, which was envisioned under Woodrow Wilson's Versailles agenda, for a very brief time seemed to be successful in adjudicating international disputes of trade or jurisdiction or borders until Adolf Hitler or the Japanese militarist or Joseph Stalin said, I don't need to listen to you. And so World War II doomed the first incarnation of a united group of nations, the League of Nations. After World War II, the same suspicious idea resurfaced with the United Nations. But this time we were going to have a Security Council, and they were going to be the world's top powers, the strongest, the most successful. And then they could be the enforcer. But the problem, of course, was that very early on, the Soviet Union was not the solution to the problem, but it was the problem itself. Because there's always going to be some country who's powerful by breaking the rules and going beyond its own prerogative. In other words, an anti-democratic China that has currently 1.5 million people in camps, and yet they're on the United Nations, and they're a citizen of the world. And if the United Nations would decide that the Chinese, contrary to the UN Charter, are putting people in concentration camps, or they're harvesting from people deemed not necessary, or they're forcing people to have that don't fit their idea of family planning, or they're bullying their neighbors, or they illegally created a base in the Spratly Islands, what is the United Nations going to do? And the answer is they can't do anything. In 2020, we saw an international pandemic, and our United Nations Charter Medical Organization, the World Health Organization, warned us from the very beginning, do not issue a travel ban against China. And then we learned that the World Health Organization was essentially parroting or mimicking what China wanted. And why did they do that? Because of Chinese money and Chinese pressure. This is not an aberration. It's inherent in the idea of global governance that there is always going to be strong powers who have agendas that are not global in scope, but they're national and sovereign. But if all the other countries in the world surrender their sovereignty and one powerful nation doesn't, then they have to come up with a mechanism of collective defense. And so far in the history of man, that's never worked.
Victor contends that big tech media is under democratic control.
All of our, we said earlier, big tech, media, investment, insurance, law are all democratic controlled, and they have global markets now. They adapted best and could adapt best to globalization. And they don't feel anymore that democracy gives them the desired result. They feel that, well, we have an equality of result, quality of opportunity society, and that's what we fought for. Our parents did. We have the 8-hour workday, the 40-hour work week, disability, equality of opportunity insured, civil rights, but we didn't get what we wanted. What we wanted was a quality of result, mandated, and that's by nature anti-democratic, because if somebody opposes you on the road to utopia, you get rid of them. So now what Michael Bloomberg says, I don't want to cooperate with the Democrats. I want to spend $50 million in Ohio to show everybody that I flipped Ohio, wasted. I want to spend $100 million in Florida to warp that election and show my power. I'm Mark Zuckerberg. I want to tell everybody that I deplatform the president. They don't believe in democracy because they feel that now the businesses and that they operate in are so influential in opinion making or in providing informational services. When I was growing up, to be on the Fortune 400, you had to be worth about 100 million in today's dollars, and now it's 6 or 7 billion probably. They have so much money that they feel that they're sort of like platonic guardian, and they can tell everybody the way the world is going to work at Davos, and this is the way it's going to work, and it's not going to apply to us because we have to be healthy and have jets and estates and compounds and multiple, but it's going to be, we know best for you.
and they have nothing but disdain and hatred for the middle class. As one of them once told me when I was arguing with him, you are the guys that have snowmobiles and jet skis, and tell me why you need a snowmobile or a jet ski. That's what he said. They have nothing. They think that the middle class lacks the culture and the sophistication and the taste of the wealthy, but it also lacks the romance of the distant poor. So they hate it. They just hate the middle class. They're very dangerous people because they're also not nationalists. So if I meet somebody of this class who's Australian or American or British, they don't believe they're British or Australian or American. They believe that they belong to an international elite. If somebody I meet from Australia is in this group in Sydney, then he feels that he knows New York better than he does a rural town in Australia.